So this is philosophy of religion, and here are some of the questions that we're going to be looking into in this class. We're going to be considering what is God like? That is, if God exists, what would God be like? And relatedly, we're going to be asking, does God exist? Does religious experience give us good reason? Hello, so this is Philosophy 113, Philosophy of Religion. In this class, we're going to be exploring some of the following questions. What is God like? That is, if God exists. Secondly, does God exist? Does religious experience give us good reason to believe in God? Can we have free will if God knows exactly how we will act? What is the relationship between faith and reason? Do we have life after death? One question you may be wondering about is how we're going to approach these questions. And part of the answer to that is that we're going to be doing a variety of reading. We're going to be doing a lot of talking. I'm going to be doing some talking and you're going to be doing some talking back. But basically, these philosophers address these questions by considering arguments. So we need to turn now to think about what an argument is. The word argument you may have used often to mean a quarrel, something that's a bad thing. But in our class, the word argument means a case for a conclusion. So you may have heard the phrase, the argument for the prosecution, or the argument for the defense, which would be the case for saying that someone is guilty, or the case for saying that someone is innocent. And usually the case will involve various bits of evidence. So what we're going to be looking for is little attempts to provide evidence for various claims. Arguments are made up of conclusions and premises. And the conclusion is a statement that you're arguing for. So for example, you might be an atheist and you might want to convince people that God does not exist. In that case, your conclusion is God does not exist. And the other part of the argument are the premises. You can have one, two, or many premises. And these premises are the statements that are used to support the conclusion. So someone might support the conclusion that God does not exist by offering these two premises, saying there's lots of suffering in the world, and if God existed, he would not allow any suffering to exist. So arguments are cases, and the case is made up of the thing you're arguing for, the conclusion, and the premises, which are the statements that are used to support the conclusion. Now, what we do when we look at arguments is we try to tell if they're good. If they're good arguments, then they have given us a reason to believe their conclusions. And if we're rational and we have a good argument for a conclusion and we don't have any good arguments against it, then we should at least tentatively believe that conclusion. On the other hand, if an argument is bad, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't support anything. It's just trash and we throw it out, or perhaps we try to fix it, but as it stands, it doesn't do anything for us. So how do we tell if an argument is good? Or in other words, how do we evaluate arguments? There are two main things that we look for when we evaluate arguments. Are the premises true, and do the premises support the conclusion? You may think, looking at these questions, that they actually amount to the same question or that they overlap, but I think that is incorrect. So to think about how these two questions can come apart, let's think about two bad arguments. Here's one bad argument. Everything Trump says is true. Trump says that London is the capital of France, so London is the capital of France. A second bad argument that's not mentioned here, but I'll just say it to you, is an argument that says Ricky is British, Ricky is annoying, therefore all British people are annoying. You can probably see that both of these arguments are bad arguments. What's wrong with the first of them clearly is that the premises are not true. Right? It's not true that everything Trump says is true, and it's not true that Trump says that London is the capital of France. So that's what's gone wrong with that argument. With the second argument I mentioned, the one about Ricky, The problem presumably is, even if those premises are true, even if there is someone called Ricky who is British and who is annoying, this does not support the claim that all British people are annoying. You can't generalize about the nature of 60 million people based on what's true of one person. So those would be two arguments where, in the first case, you have false premises leading to a conclusion. In this second case, you have true premises that do not support it, do not lead to their conclusion. So we are interested in both these things. We're interested in whether the premises are true and whether the premises support the conclusion. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of support. There are two main kinds of argument that we would like to distinguish: deductive arguments and inductive arguments. You may have heard these terms in other contexts, and you may have seen them defined in a variety of ways. But I think it would be important for us to define them in the way that I'm going to define them, and for you to use them in the way that I'm going to be using them, just because that is the standard way that philosophers and logicians use these terms. So the first notion, the notion of a deductive argument, is this. The goal of a deductive argument is for the premises to guarantee the conclusion. And the best example to think about this is a mathematical proof. So think about Pythagoras' theorem, for example. This is a proof that this is the way right-angled triangles have to behave. It's not, oh, this is how right-angled triangles probably behave or typically behave. This is how right-angled triangles have to behave. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, are aimed at having the premises make the conclusion more probable without being absolutely certain relative to the premises. As you may guess from the notion of more probable, this comes in degrees, right? An argument may make its conclusion slightly more probable than not, or it might make it 99.9% probable. But so this success comes in degrees. These types of arguments, inductive arguments, can be seen in context of medical research, where a researcher might have a drug that she wants to test for side effects. She might test the drug on a set of rats and find that it's perfectly safe when used in rats, and so she concludes by induction that it's probably safe for humans. She might do the test with some human subjects and conclude that since it was fine for these test subjects, it's going to be fine for all humans, but it's not absolutely inevitable. Similarly, election polling. So pollsters might call up a number of randomly chosen voters in Florida and find that 61% of them are going to vote for Joe Biden in the primary, and the pollster concludes that probably Joe Biden will win the primary. In that case, very high likelihood that they are correct. There are other examples, but they function in a similar way. In our class, in philosophy generally, most of the arguments we're going to come across will be deductive arguments. This might come as a surprise to you, but that is how it is in philosophy. There will be 2 or 3 examples of inductive arguments that we will talk about. So we will revisit the notion of inductive arguments later on, but for now we're going to be focusing primarily on deductive arguments. So the notion of a premises guaranteeing their conclusion is the notion of validity. Validity, the word valid is a term that you may have heard used often just to mean something that's good or reasonable or plausible, but in our context it has a slightly technical meaning, and I'd like you to pay attention to this and make sure you understand it and can apply it effectively. So the formal definition of a valid argument is an argument that where it is not possible for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. Another way of saying that is to say a valid argument is one in which if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Let's think about some examples. If you have your course packet, you can look at there's a set of examples on page 2, and I would like you to look through those examples. Perhaps we can stop the video now. We've got to 10 minutes, and you can spend a few minutes looking over those examples. Try to decide in your own mind whether they're valid, whether they're such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So maybe just jot down some answers to whether those are valid and why you think those are valid, and then we will come back and talk about that more.